I mean, he actually caught HIV, like having like a lot of women.
Oh yeah, let's just go down the rabbit hole of all of his sins. He faced that head up. How many dudes is running around undetectable, G,
Come on,
in the game?
man.
Because I could tell you 20 right now that I could rattle off names.
When Diddy stepped into the detention center that gray October morning, you could feel the air shift. Everyone knew he was coming. For weeks his name had been whispered in the halls and murmured among the gods. This wasn't just any inmate, this was a man who once had the world at his feet, someone whose fame and fortune made him feel untouchable. But the man who walked out of that van wasn't what I expected. He didn't look larger than life. He didn't carry himself like someone who still believed he mattered. His shoulders was slouched, his steps slow and deliberate, his face was blank, but not in a way that suggested defiance. It was more like resignation. You're about to hear the truth about what happens when a man like that falls. The story of his time inside this detention center will haunt you long after this video ends. If stories like this grip you, if you're drawn to the raw, unfiltered realities behind the now, Diddy's world came crashing down. The van rolled in just after sunrise. It was one of those mornings where the clouds hung low, pressing against the horizon. A few guards, myself included, stood near the gates watching silently as the vehicle approached. The engine's hum echoed in the stillness, drawing curious glances from inmates peering out of their grimy windows. When the doors opened, Diddy stepped out slowly, his wrists cuffed in front of him. He hesitated for half a second, his eyes scanning the area like he was trying to understand where he was. There were no photographers, no cameras flashing, no fans calling his name, just the sound of the gate slamming shut behind him and the distant murmurs of gods. The first thing he must have noticed was the smell. This place stank of damp concrete, sweat, and decay. The walls were cracked and covered in streaks of grime, the floors stained from decades of neglect. The air felt thick, humid, as if even it couldn't escape inside. The hallways were narrow and dimly lit. The flickering fluorescent lights cast strange shadows on the walls, making the place feel alive in the worst way. I'd worked here for years, but even I couldn't shake the oppressive atmosphere. This wasn't a place for redemption. It was a place where men came to disappear. Diddy walked quietly through the intake process, fingerprints, photos, standard issued clothing. It was the same routine we'd done 1,000 times before, but watching him go through it felt surreal. He wasn't defiant, and he wasn't scared. He was just quiet. He nodded at instructions, answered in low tones, and accepted the orange jumpsuit with a small, resigned sigh. The other guards didn't speak much, but their glances said enough. We all knew who he was, but none of us treated him any differently. Fame meant nothing here. As he walked to his cell, the sound of his footsteps echoed off the concrete. Inmates pressed their faces against the bars of their cells, watching intently. Some shouted insults, their voices dripping with mockery. Guess you're not so special now, one man yelled, grinning. You better get used to it, superstar. Another jeered. This place doesn't care who you are. Diddy didn't flinch. He kept his head forward, his steps steady. But I could see it, the way his hands tightened into fists, the way his jaw clenched. He wasn't ignoring them out of pride. He was holding everything and trying to keep himself from falling apart. When he reached his cell, he stepped inside without hesitation. The door clanged shut behind him. And for a moment he just stood there, taking it all in. The space was small and bare, a narrow bed with a thin, stained mattress, a metal toilet bolted to the floor, and a tiny window high up on the wall. The light that filtered through was faint, barely enough to illuminate the room. I watched him glance toward that window, his face unreadable. Then he sat on the edge of the bed, his elbows resting on his knees, and stared at the floor. The first few days passed in relative silence. Diddy didn't speak much, not to the guards or the other inmates. He stuck to his cell, only emerging when he had to. During meals, he'd grab his tray and sit alone in the far corner of the cafeteria. He ate sparingly, just enough to keep going, though even that seemed like a struggle. The cafeteria wasn't much better than the rest of the detention center. The paint was peeling off the walls, exposing patches of raw concrete beneath. The tables bolted to the floor were scratched and dented from years of abuse. The food was barely edible, bland, overcooked, and served in plastic trays that looked older than some of the inmates. It didn't take long for the other prisoners to lose interest in him. At first his presence was a novelty. People whispered about him, tried to provoke him, threw insults his way. But when he didn't respond, they moved on. It was as if they realized there was nothing to gain by poking at him. In some ways that made him even more of an enigma. He didn't react like other men in his position might have. There was no anger, no attempt to prove himself. He just existed, quietly fading into the background. I noticed how often he gravitated toward the small window in his cell. Every morning, when the weak sunlight crept through the bars, he'd stand there for a few minutes, his hands resting lightly on the sill. It wasn't much, just a sliver of light cutting through the grime, but it seemed to be enough for him. It struck me how human that moment was. He wasn't looking for freedom or escape. He just wanted to feel something warm on his skin, something real in a place that felt so far removed from the world outside. By the end of the first month, the changes in him were obvious. He was losing weight quickly. His uniform, which had fit him well when he arrived, now hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His face had grown pale, his cheekbones sharp against his skin. His silence persisted. But it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was heavy, oppressive, like he was carrying the weight of the world inside his head. One evening I passed by his cell during my rounds and heard him muttering softly to himself. I paused, unsure if I should keep going or listen. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but I caught fragments of what he was saying. I should have done it differently. He murmured, "None of this was worth it." I stayed there for a moment, watching through the small window in his door. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his head bowed. It was the first time I truly saw the cracks in his exterior, the weight of regret pressing down on him. The detention center itself didn't make things any easier. The building was falling apart, its walls covered in graffiti and cracks that spidered out like scars. The plumbing was unreliable, and the smell of mold clung to everything. Even the air felt thick, stagnant, like it had been trapped in the building for years. Fights broke out regularly, though Diddy never got involved. He kept his distance, his head down, avoiding confrontation. But the violence was unavoidable. Screams and shouts echoed through the halls, punctuated by the occasional sound of fists meeting flesh. This wasn't a place for redemption. It was a place where men came to disappear, to be forgotten, and Diddy, for all his fame and notoriety, was no exception. As October turned into November, and then December, his routine became more mechanical. Wake up, shuffle to the cafeteria, pick at his food, and retreat to his cell. Sometimes he'd sit on the edge of his bed, staring at the small pile of papers he kept on the desk. I saw him writing occasionally, though whatever he wrote never seemed to satisfy him. He'd crumple the paper into a tight ball and toss it aside before starting over. By the time I walked by, his floor was often littered with crumpled sheets, a visual representation of the frustration boiling just under the surface. By December, the quiet routine Diddy had settled into began to unravel. It wasn't just his physical decline that was becoming harder to ignore. It was the way the tension around him was starting to crackle. In prison, silence and solitude can be seen as strength, but they can also make you a target. Some inmates didn't take kindly to the way Diddy kept to himself, his head down, his mouth shut. To them, it was arrogance. They saw him as someone who thought he was better than the rest of them. And in a place like this that didn't sit well, it started small. A shove in the cafeteria line, a shoulder bump as he walked to his cell. At first, Diddy didn't react. He kept moving, ignoring the provocations, but the more he ignored them, the more persistent they became. One day, as he sat in his usual corner of the cafeteria, a group of inmates approached him. I was standing near the wall watching as one of them, a wiry man with tattoos crawling up his neck, leaned over Diddy's table. "You think you're too good to sit with us?" the man sneered. Diddy's cell again. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, staring at the photograph he always kept close. His face was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light, and his breathing was shallow. Each rise and fall of his chest labored and slow. He didn't notice me standing there, or if he did, he didn't care. His focus was entirely on the small window near the ceiling, where a faint beam of moonlight filtered through the bars. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. I watched as he tilted his head back, letting the light fall across his face. For a brief moment, he almost looked peaceful, like he was somewhere far away from here. But then he shifted his shoulders, slumping further, and the fragile illusion shattered. I wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. What could I possibly say to a man who had already lost so much? So I walked away, the sound of his shallow breathing following me down the hall. By now, Diddy's trial feels more like an abstraction than a reality. It's still 3 months away, but with the way he's deteriorating, it's hard to imagine him making it that far. The man who walked into this prison back in October with his head held high and his name still carrying weight is gone. What's left is someone who has been stripped of everything: his pride, his strength, even his ability to keep going. And if something doesn't change soon, I think we all know how this story will end. If this story gave you a glimpse into the fragile line between power and vulnerability, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here we bring you the raw, unfiltered story that the world rarely sees. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, and remember, no one is invincible. And thanks for watching this video, guys. Stay tuned. Bye bye.